So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacture hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now we're in a new phase of the clean energy revolution. Clean Energy 1.1 was, hey, here's an interesting technology. Let's develop it and see if we can sell it. Solar started that way. EVs started that way. Heat pumps started that way. Other things too. Solar thermal going back 50, 100 years. Clean Energy 2.0 was the next phase. Buy it because it's clean and maybe these incentives will help the economics. That was kind of the growth stage of the general product life cycle for clean energy technologies. Now we're in clean energy 3.0. Solar, batteries, wind, they're by far and away the cheapest ways to produce and store energy. And now we've got economics as the driving force. It's not just clean energy, it's economics. And, when you kind of get to that tipping point, things really can start growing fast. Now, incentives still help accelerate deployments, and we still need them to kind of make this transition more quickly. But the fundamental economics are really strong. I mean, ask any utility, what's the cheapest way to generate and store power? It's solar and batteries. EVs are cheaper to operate than gas vehicles, and EV prices keep coming down fast. I read an article today that a used EV is only 5% more expensive than a used gas SUV. Heat pumps, cheaper to operate than gas furnaces, much safer, much more comfortable. But when it comes to clean energy, there's dirty energy, there's incumbent energy, and those competitors are fighting back really hard. When it comes to homeowners deciding on the energy sources and the way you're going to be powering your home or your vehicles, or even venture capital investors betting on new clean energy technologies, it's critical to understand that the game has changed. We're into 3.0 right now. Energy is cheaper and cleaner than ever, but there's still a lot of misinformation out there. There's many well-intentioned but doomed products. People coming up with an idea, hey, I thought about this would work really well. Maybe they didn't have enough experience. Maybe they're kind of pushing the edges of engineering. Maybe there's some scientific reasons. Maybe they haven't figured out the economics. And the worst thing is we have incumbent energy industries like the fossil fuel industry. They're lying through their teeth. They're promoting policies that are just fundamentally flawed from an economic and a thermodynamic standpoint, but it helps their economics. And here's a typical example. I call them clueless coal. That clean lump of coal that's being promoted by the fossil fuel industry. Completely tone deaf. So don't let coal misinformation guide you astray. Here are 4 clean energy mistakes that you should try to avoid. First, electrons are always going to be molecules in this new generation of clean energy. Second, policies and politics are critical. They get in the way of what ordinarily may be good economic and thermodynamic decisions. Number 3, don't bet against silicon and lithium. Really simple. And if you want to bet against it, maybe there's a big return, but it's going to be very risky. And then 4th, pay attention to thermodynamics and economics. So by far and away, the most important change that I consider is that electrons are more efficient and the better way to produce and generate and distribute and use energy than molecules. And here's what I mean by that. We're in the electrical age. We're no longer in the mechanical age. Producing, moving, and using energy in electrical form, electrons, is now inherently much cheaper than energy and fuels. And we'll go into the reasons for that. But here's the thing. Fuels are composed of molecules. I'm talking about methane, octane, other hydrocarbons, even wood. You've got lots and lots of molecules that are bound together. And when you burn them, they're oxidized, it uses oxygen, and that creates heat, and that heat can do work. But these fuels, and the most efficient ones right now are basically natural gas and oil. But, from the standpoint of oil, those fuels need to be extracted, they need to be refined, they need to be piped, they need to be burned with inherent pollution in engines, or they need to be used as heat. And when you think about it, moving energy with electrons is just inherently cheaper. All you need are solar panels or wind turbines, some wires, and maybe some batteries to store the energy. The variable costs for these new technologies are effectively zero. And that's why you don't have like all these ongoing costs. Bottom line, generating, distributing, and using electrical energy is much cheaper and much cleaner. So let's just look at the example of gas vehicles. Let's think about a gas vehicle. To make that typical vehicle, talk about a small SUV or a car, to make that car go 25 miles using a gallon of gasoline, that $6 gas, it's over $6 right now in California. It's probably going to keep going up, and hopefully it'll come down someday, but the hormone rate is pretty much blocked. It's going to take some time. But that $6 a gallon gas, it came from decomposed plants and marine life. It came from 100 million years ago. So what happens is the oil companies find the oil by testing, drilling wells, and using some clever techniques that they developed over the last 100 years. They drill down a mile or more. They pump the oil out of that well. They then truck that crude oil or use pipelines to get it to a refinery. And then they add hydrogen and they crack that into gasoline. And now, once you've got that gasoline at the refinery, that gasoline has to be sent via pipeline or trucks to the local filling station. And then we pump the gas out of the gas station, pump it into our car. Except in New Jersey, somebody does it for you there in New Jersey. That's one of the great things about New Jersey. Pump the gas, and then we drive away. And that gas is then burned inside the car's engine to combustion. You get little explosions, the motor goes, the car goes ahead. And the byproducts are mostly CO2 and water vapor. It's technically a clean combustion, but that CO2 is a pollutant, plus other pollutants like nitrous and sulfur oxides. And those are worse on older cars. The new cars are pretty much just CO2 and water vapor. But it's a very inefficient and costly process. And you look at it, it costs $6 to go that 25 miles on gasoline. Now, think about EVs. To make that electric car go 25 miles, a typical EV is going to need about 9 kilowatt hours of energy. More efficient cars can use less energy. A big EV pickup truck is probably going to be like 10 or 12 kilowatt hours per mile. But that 9 kilowatt hours of energy came from photons that are generated by nuclear fusion in the sun. When that fusion happens, it takes about 8 minutes for that photon to get from the sun, 93 million miles away, to Earth, where they hit a solar panel, and 22% of the incident photons are converted into electrons. That's a 22% solar panel, pretty efficient. The rest of that energy from that photon is converted into heat. Now, in your home solar and battery system, electricity is stored in your battery, or it can be used to directly charge the EV if it's plugged in at that time. And obviously, if you plug in later at night, you're just charging your car from the energy that's in your home battery. In a utility solar farm, that electricity is not used immediately in the home, in the building. It's transmitted over long-distance transmission lines, and then it goes to a local utility substation and then to public EV chargers or to someone's home. Now, in this whole process, the only moving parts from the sun to the car are in the car's electric motor. Once the fixed costs for the solar panels, the wires, the transformers, and substations are paid for, there's no variable costs. I mean, the photon comes from the sun and eventually it gets into your car. There's not a single moving part except for the motor, which drives the wheels. So for homes with solar, we kind of look at what some of these numbers are. For homes in solar at an amortized rate of about 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and that's how much your system's going to cost on the average over the 20 or 30 lifetime of the system. The cost of that 9 kilowatt hours to go 25 miles at 10 is only 10 cents a kilowatt hour. That's 90 cents. That's why it's so cheap to drive an EV. If you were to charge your home V from the electric grid, let's say you don't have solar, you're going to be currently at California rates pay about 35 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's going to cost you $3.15 to get that 9 kilowatt hours of energy to go that 25 miles. Worst case with an EV, if you use a public EV charging station, and I'm just picking a number of about 50 cents a kilowatt hour, the prices of electricity vary a lot depending on what public EV charger you plug in at, et cetera. The cost of that 9 kilowatt hours to go 25 miles is about $4.50 a watt. Worst case, it's $6 for the gasoline and $4.50 for public EV charging. Best case, it's 90 cents if you charge it at home. Other examples of electrical energy being much cheaper than molecular energy are something called mechanical energy storage. There's a company called Energy Vault, and their idea is kind of it'll work. Moving big, huge concrete blocks up and down in elevators and shuffling them around. As you raise up those blocks, you're using electricity, but then you're creating potential energy from the weight of, the hundreds of these humongous multi-ton blocks. And when you lower the blocks, those lowering blocks can be running a generator. So it's kind of an idea to use cheap grid power to raise the blocks up when the electricity is cheap, and then lower the blocks using a generator to create power when electricity is expensive. It's a huge mechanical monstrosity. And once again, when you look at the cost trajectory of solar and batteries coming down so fast, that system just too many freaking moving parts, too expensive to operate. And oops, I've been watching Energy Vault for a while, and they recently restructured now, and they're head of the front of their website basically shows that they're doing batteries now. Big duh. Another thing that's happening is large scale geothermal is becoming a thing right now. There's companies that are coming out saying, hey, we're going to use oil drilling techniques and fracking and drill, 2-3 mile wells. And we're going to heat fluid by pumping it way down into the ground. And that hot fluid's going to come up, and then we're going to run that through turbines and create electricity. The question really becomes is it going to work at scale, and is it going to compete against the, solar and batteries? It might work. It's going to put a lot of oil well drillers back to work. It might be relatively clean as long as there's not a lot of excess water or bad chemicals coming out of the ground. But you have to remember that these geothermal systems, it's basically a conventional power plant. They're going to use that really, really hot rocks down below to create steam. And they're going to have steam turbines and generators from electricity, which have a lot of moving parts, and they require maintenance that they're not cheap to install. But then you got to remember that you've got a lot of piping, you got a lot of mechanical parts, and drilling these deep wells could be geographically undesirable. You don't really want it in a suburban area. So you're going to have to do it far away from where people aren't living, and they're not going to be bothered by this. And then since these power plants are not going to happen, right where the buildings are, you're going to need to add a lot of electrical infrastructure for these geothermal power plants to get the power to the buildings that need the power. So that's one of the challenges when you come up with these new concepts is you say, okay, well, that's a great idea, but the power plant's really far away, and now we need a huge cost for transmission and distribution. So keep in mind that there's the economies of scale when we're piping fluids, or you're running long distance of wires, or you're refining oil, or you're installing and maintaining turbines and all that mechanical equipment. It's very expensive. And the fundamental beauty of solar is a generation system, AKA solar panels. They're mass manufactured, and they keep producing power, and costs keep coming down. So, it's kind of sad that people are trying to say, hey, here's something that's great. I can make it competitive with solar and storage, but then solar and storage keeps getting cheaper and cheaper. Let's talk about another challenge that people have, coming up, whether it's a home or investors. You have to remember in the energy industry, politics and policies are really, really critical. And these politics and policies can be pretty dramatic over time. I mean, heck, here in the United States, it's like a ping pong ball. Every 4 years, we go back and forth between clean energy is good, clean energy is bad, clean energy is good, clean energy is bad. It's going to be hopefully clean energy is good in another few years. So timing becomes really important if you're a consumer to buy something, and it becomes even more challenging when things are going to change from a manufacturing standpoint, because political and policy obstacles can block or completely sidetrack new technologies. So it's important to understand this environment in the energy industry, especially when it comes to utilities. When the economics are strong enough, bad energy policies can be pushed aside. That happened here in the U.S. when we kind of got away from using coal, because the utilities say, hey, coal is so expensive, natural gas is cheaper, solar and batteries are way, way cheaper, let's not use coal. But then some policies change where some people at the top of the Trump administration said, hey, we insist that we keep using coal. That's really dumb. The same thing happened with wind. The Trump administration said, we insist that wind is bad. But wind has a lot of momentum. It's very economically feasible. There were wind turbines going in all over the place. But the current Trump administration basically said, we're going to stop that dead in its tracks. And they actually had to spend money, illegally cancel projects to shut down these wind turbine installations, which were going to generate a tremendous amount of power, which were extremely expensive, and that was a sunk cost. And they're basically just saying, shut it down. And there's a lot of lawsuits that are coming out of that. It's a really stupid thing. I mean, just let those wind turbines go, because it's really cost effective, and they're pretty much already done. Another example that's happening is that the fossil fuel companies, particularly natural gas companies, but any fossil fuel, they're lobbying against heat pumps, and they're lobbying against communities that have banned the future installations of natural gas infrastructure. Now, the reason why these bans happened is because, first, they make really good economic sense. And second is, if you say to a new development, or if you say to a homeowner, you need to put in gas, that means forever that house is not going to have a gas bill. And the gas companies obviously don't like that. This is happening all over the U.S. I even saw that there's some legislation proposed to make it illegal to ban natural gas. It's stupid. Let economics go, but we'll see what happens. You have to be careful about these policies and politics, because right now, in 2026, they're clearly on the side of fossil fuels. That may change if there's a big administration change in 2029. My next important recommendation is very simply, don't bet against silicon solar cells and lithium ion batteries. Time and time again, companies promote new energy systems that claim to be better than silicon PV solar and lithium-ion battery storage. Now, as I mentioned, geothermal is the latest contender. Nuclear fusion is still being developed. Heck, I remember when I was in grade school back in the 60s, they were talking about nuclear fusion reactors. That's been going on for 60 plus years. And there's a lot of nuclear fission startups that are making small nuclear reactors, that are making big reactors, that are coming up with new ways of doing things. The reality is, when you have your main customers, like utilities, saying, we don't want to buy nuclear fission anymore because it's just not economic, but then you still have incentives to push these things, and you have the government saying, hey, we're going to push this. It's very unwise. I can't help from thinking back to the issue that happened with Cylinder, which we'll get to in a minute, about how the Republicans were saying we don't want to bet on winners and losers, and Cylinder was the biggest loser. Well, there's a lot of losers coming along right now, including coal, and I expect a lot of the nuclear fission startups. Yeah, and one of the reasons is the last nuclear plant built in the U.S. is the Vogtle plant in South Carolina. It took $20 billion. That's not including decommissioning it someday. And it took 15 years to get that plant completed. So when you're looking at all these new technologies, you know, silicon, solar, and lithium-ion technologies keep getting better. Now, there'll be versions of silicon solar like perovskites. There's going to be versions of lithium-ion batteries that maybe, you know, solid state batteries, things like that. But they're going to continue to get better and better. As these new technologies or better technologies like nuclear fusion, nuclear fission, geothermal, they struggle to get out of the lab or into widespread deployment. You got to remember that the costs of solar and storage keep coming down. Of course, from an investor standpoint, there's lots of money to be made if you can kind of create the next world-beating silicon solar or solid-state battery or nuclear fusion reactor that's going to be able to be installed, you know, in every single house. A lot of money to be made. But you got to remember that the dominant technologies currently are also quickly improving. Here's a case study of how companies bet against solar and batteries, and they just got absolutely creamed. It's called the Ivanpah Solar Farm, which is in the Mojave Desert west of Las Vegas. There was one, and now there's three huge fields of concentrating solar tracking mirrors and enormous steam generator plants. Now, this thing was started in 2010. I remember even, you know, that was when the construction started, but they've been kicking around for years before. It was built by Bechtel, and the power was being purchased by PG&E. So, you know, really big companies, smart companies, betting on what they thought would be a good technology. But, you know, some engineers weren't really looking at the future very well. This Ivanpah Solar Concentrating Farm project was started in 2010. It was a tremendous engineering achievement. I remember flying over it. I mean, you see these super bright dots at the center of each of these circular arrays. There's three of them. It was like something out of, you know, a James Bond movie. It was really, really cool. Tremendous engineering achievement. However, when when the sun went down, in order to keep the working fluids hot, in order to start them up again, they couldn't just start them from the sun. They had to have a natural gas plant to heat up the working fluids every single morning. And there's a lot of mirrors that had to be moved around. That the steam turbines, obviously, it's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of maintenance required. Bottom line, it turned out to be way too expensive and way too expensive to maintain. And, it was obvious to photovoltaic people in the industry like me that trackers and steam turbines and fixed, moving mirrors couldn't possibly compete with the steady cost declines in PV. Now, don't get me wrong, trackers are being used almost, universally for utility scale solar, but we're just tracking with standard solar panels. It's not a mirrors focusing it on a hotspot. So the proof that this whole big Ivanpah solar farm really didn't really make that much sense was that, ironically, even bigger photovoltaic solar farms started getting installed in the same barren desert to the northeast of the Ivanpah solar trackers. So these solar farms started in 2014, and they were much cheaper to build and maintain. And now, over the last year or so, there's been calls to turn off or shut down the Ivanpah solar farm because even though it's all done, it's still too expensive to maintain. And these large solar farms using solar trackers are just way, way cheaper. So another example, which is something very close to my heart, when it comes to rooftop solar, there used to be a technology, this is what I studied in college and afterwards, is solar thermal. So solar thermal panels that went on the roof. We heated hot water. We used that hot water for heating the house or domestic hot water. That was a big thing in California too. But what happened is the same cost decline issue happened with photovoltaics and actually heat pumps. And there was no cost declines that were happening with the manufacturing of the rooftop solar thermal panels. So about 15 years ago, it became apparent that it was cheaper to put up a couple of solar photovoltaic panels and run a heat pump than it was to put in a more expensive solar thermal hot water system. And that those economics became so compelling that, in accept it for commercial applications. It doesn't make a lot of sense to heat water on your roof for your domestic hot water or for your home's use. It makes much more sense to use photovoltaics and use a heat pump, which is 350% efficient, and go that way. So same cost decline issue. Betting against solar and now betting against batteries is very risky. And, for our customers that have solar with batteries and they have solar on the roof with heat pumps, those batteries can run the heat pumps at night. That's what I do. It's fine. You get effectively a zero electric bill. My third recommendation is pay close attention to thermodynamics and economics. And these are things that we learned in college or grad school. They're fundamentally really, really important. I see too many energy products and concepts that avoid the painful truths of thermodynamics. In other words, from an engineering standpoint, just doesn't make sense. Or economics, engineering wise, it works. But when you run through the economics, that there's a better solution. My advice is use your own brain. Look at these things critically when evaluating revolutionary new energy products. Does their value proposition make thermodynamic and economic sense? Here's an example. One of the biggest, most painful ones is Solyndra. It was a solar company, 20 years ago or so. And they had a revolutionary new type of solar panel based on an array of cylindrical cells like fluorescent light tubes. So you had this rack, a little rack, maybe, 3 by 5 feet. And there was, a couple dozen cylindrical tubes in there. On the inside of these cylindrical tubes, there was photovoltaic material. So when the sun hit these tubes, you were able to generate some electricity. And the brainstorm, I don't know whose brainstorm this was, but the brainstorm was that these cylinders would be more efficient and more economically beneficial than standard flat plate solar electric panels and standard PV panels. Simple geometry says that a standard flat solar panel is going to be more efficient when capturing incident solar radiation. And when, you just kind of have to look at it, it's obvious. But there was a lot of arm waving and mass production claims and rose-colored glasses being worn by Solyndra executives that the concept made a lot of sense. They raised a ton of money. They got a DOE loan guarantee. But based on the simple geometry of their solar panel and the economics of doing this, it's more expensive to make cylindrical solar cells than it is to basically just have a photovoltaic panel. Cylinder was simply unable to keep up with the standard mass-produced solar panels, and they became a poster child for how bad solar was, bad decisions, things like that. I was even on Fox News once, and they're basically claiming that I was kind of defending the fact that you got to make some bets that are not going to work out. And Fox News was basically saying, we don't want to bet on winners and losers. We want the market to take care of that. Well, yeah. Guess who's betting big time on losers right now? And there's no question about it. That's what's happening in the U.S. Here's another head scratcher, courtesy of the fossil fuel industry: direct air capture of CO2. Problem, at least when acknowledged, is there's too much CO2 in the air. Yeah, we kind of, agree that there's a lot of CO2 in the air. Some people, 3% of the scientists say that's a problem and it's being caused by man. But there's too much CO2 in the air, and it's coming pretty much undeniably from our fossil fuel burning over the last 150 years. So solution number one to having too much CO2 in the air is stop burning fossil fuels, which is creating all that CO2 to begin with. And then natural processes are going to gradually balance that CO2 out. We're going to consume it. It could take a couple dozen years, but we'll get that solved as long as we stop burning fossil fuels. Now, solution number two is keep burning fossil fuels because there's a lot of money to be made by oil and gas companies. And then we're going to use direct air capture to remove the CO2 from the air that our products actually created. And then we're going to convince the public that direct air capture is practical and cost effective, ignoring the simple fact that removing the CO2 itself uses a tremendous amount of energy, and it's going to take a long time. So here's the reality. There's 400 parts of CO2 per million parts of air, and this is done on a molecular basis. So that's basically, you have 4 CO2 molecules for every 10,000 regular molecules. That's 1 CO2 molecule for every 2,500 molecules of other gases. Now imagine that you have a big jar full of 2,499 white marbles, and there's 1 black marble in there. That's very diluted. It's going to take a long time to kind of find that 1 black marble and take it out. Very inefficient. So here's how direct air capture works. You have giant fans just sucking in all the ambient air in the area. And these big fans use a lot of electricity. That air is then passed through either a liquid or a solid filter that captures only the CO2 molecules, only the 1 out of 2,500 molecules that kind of gets through, it gets captured. And then these filters are heated to dry out the CO2 because you got to kind of recapture it somehow. And this heat is coming. I mean, you can get the heat from fossil fuels, but if you're burning the heat from fossil fuels, you're adding more CO2 than you're taking out. So you have to heat those filters and extract the CO2 with electricity, and that electricity has to come from renewable sources, most likely solar and wind. You then take that CO2 and you compress it, and then you pipe it or truck it, and then you inject it deeply underground, or you find a way to kind of build it into concrete, which is kind of tricky. But basically, what we're doing with all this captured CO2, or capturing it in other ways too, is we're sequestering it. That's the word. And basically, we pump it into like old oil and gas wells, and then cap the well, and then hope that it doesn't burp out over time. And I'm very skeptical that that's going to stay there. Here's the numbers. Removing a single ton of CO2 from the air with this process, it takes about 2,000 kilowatt hours of energy. The only way that direct air capture works to remove a net amount of CO2 is if that entire plant is run on solar and wind. You could probably do it also with hydro, but that's, doesn't make a lot of sense. You can't put a lot of hydro in. So the thermodynamics, the fundamental thermodynamics of direct air capture are embarrassingly bad. And the economics are even worse. Unless you're a fossil fuel company. And if you're a fossil fuel company using the future potential of direct air capture to clean our air as an excuse to burn more fuel now and make profits now, and especially if you can get the government to pay for all these things, then it kind of makes economic sense if you're a fossil fuel company, but not for anybody else. So direct air capture is a perfect example of Coley. He's my enemy of the week, leading you astray. So here are the conclusions. Just, if you're an investor, or most importantly, if you're a homeowner, Energy 3.0 is all about cheap electrons created from solar and wind, and it's stored in batteries, and it's about using those electrons in clean, efficient EVs, in heat pumps, and you can use it for industry process heat. You can use it for a lot of things, but it's very, very inexpensive. You got to remember, our policies and politics are going to change. We had, great clean energy enthusiasm in the last presidential administration, and we have antagonism in the current presidential administration. And I can pretty much guarantee that's what's going to happen in the subsequent administration is going to change once again. Hopefully, on the side of a little bit more rational economics and thermodynamics. So if you're a homeowner, take advantage of the deals you can get right now. The deals for putting in solar and batteries are pretty good because there's still a way to monetize that tax credit through financing. And especially, looking at an EV, it's way cheaper here with $6 gas and going up fast. It's way cheaper to drive an EV than to be pumping that $6 gas. I mean, here off of Cinnamon Energy Systems, we're getting killed because we got a lot of these gasoline trucks and our fuel bills have gone absolutely through the roof. So take advantage of what you can get right now. And because you can pretty much count that utility and fossil fuel and energy is going to continue to be expensive. Utility rates are going up because of this AI build out. And gas prices probably going to keep coming up. I think they'll go down once we solve the issue in the Hormuz Strait with Iran, but that could take a while. And two other things, very simply, don't bet against silicon and lithium. If somebody comes to you with, a brand new battery chemistry or, a better way to generate power on your roof with maybe a little mini windmill, it's going to be risky. And finally, pay attention to thermodynamics and economics and don't listen to Coley. That's all the time we have in this week's Energy Show. Thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. And if you miss any of today's show, you can always go to our website at energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's Energy Show.